The truth is out there, buried in DNA and time. Subscribe so you're first to uncover what's next. 35,000 years ago, someone was buried in a cave in what is now Belgium. Their bones held a genetic signature, a specific, identifiable ancestry component that geneticists can trace like a fingerprint through time. Then that signature disappears. Not fades, disappears. For more than 15,000 years, not one skeleton, not one burial site, not one sample anywhere on the European continent carries it. And then, in bones dated to roughly 14,000 years ago, it comes back, nearly unchanged, as if it had simply been waiting somewhere, untouched by 15,000 years of ice, migration, famine, and extinction. Populations don't do that. Genes don't sit dormant in soil, holding their shape, waiting for the right century to resurface. A lineage either continues, generation to generation, leaving fainter and fainter traces in the DNA of the people who come after it, or it ends. What geneticists found in Ice Age Europe fits neither. It vanishes cleanly. It returns cleanly. And it does this not once, not at a single site, but across a scatter of locations, in multiple countries, separated by thousands of years and hundreds of miles. Researchers have a term for genetic material like this: ancestry that shows up mathematically in a population's DNA, but was never directly recovered from an actual skeleton in between. They call it a ghost population, a presence proven by its effects, without a body to match it to. And in this case, the ghost isn't hypothetical. It has a name, a location, and a 15,000-year gap that no one has been able to close. How does an entire bloodline vanish from a continent for 15,000 years, then walk right back in? And where, exactly, was it hiding? Before that gap became a problem, there was a story. A tidy one, the kind every textbook agrees on. Modern Europeans, according to the standard model built over the past decade and a half, descend from 3 ancestral populations layered on top of one another like sediment. First, the Western hunter-gatherers, the deep, indigenous Ice Age population. Then the early European farmers, arriving from Anatolia roughly 8,000 years ago, bringing agriculture with them. Then the Yamnaya, steppe pastoralists from the region north of the Black Sea, sweeping into Europe around 4,900 years ago, and reshaping the genetic map almost completely. This framework was built largely by David Reich's lab at Harvard Medical School, alongside geneticist Iosif Lazaridis, through comparisons of hundreds of ancient genomes published across the 2010s. Under this model, hunter-gatherers are treated as a single continuous population, occupying Europe from the first arrival of modern humans roughly 45,000 years ago, through the Aurignacian culture, into the Gravitian, the culture associated with sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic and the Goyet Caves in Belgium. Then came the last glacial maximum, the coldest stretch of the Ice Age, roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, when much of the continent became uninhabitable and populations were believed to have retreated into southern refuges: Iberia, Italy, the Balkans. Then the Magdalenian re-expansion, as the ice retreated and people moved back north. Survive the cold, retreat south, wait it out, re-expand. That is the accepted rhythm, one population, thinning and stretching, but never actually breaking. The assumption underneath all of it is simple. If a genetic signature existed in Europe before the Ice Age, it should still be traceable, diluted, mixed, faint, in the populations that came after. Continuity, not disappearance. That is the model. That is what the data was supposed to show. Here is where it gets complicated. When researchers went back and actually sequenced the oldest layer of this supposedly continuous population, one specific 35,000-year-old genetic signature simply refused to show up again in any of the skeletons that came directly after it. That signature has a name. Geneticists call it Goyet Q2, after the individual it was first identified in, excavated from the Goyet Caves in Belgium. The work identifying and naming this ancestry component was led by Cosimo Post, at the time based at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, later at the University of Tübingen, published in Current Biology in 2016, as part of a broader study mapping the deep population structure of Ice Age Europe. Goyet Q2-related ancestry turns up in a handful of individuals during the Gravettian period, roughly 35,000 to 26,000 years ago. Then, nothing. It is absent from every genome sampled during and immediately after the last glacial maximum, a span researchers place at roughly 25,000 to 19,000 years ago. Absent through the coldest years. absent through the supposed retreat south, absent through the re-expansion. And then, in genomes dated to roughly 14,000 years ago, associated with what researchers call the Villabruna cluster, first identified in a skeleton from Villabruna in northern Italy, and echoed in individuals as far away as El Mirón cave in Spain. It reappears. Work associated with Johannes Krause's lab at the Max Planck Institute, alongside geneticist He Yu, has traced this reappearance directly back to the earlier Goyet Q2 signature, though the exact framing of that connection is still something researchers are careful to describe in terms of probability rather than certainty. This is where the safe version of the story, the one where Goyet Q2 people simply survived quietly in some untouched refuge, runs into a wall. If that lineage had genuinely been surviving the entire time in a southern pocket of Europe, there should be intermediate genomes, bridge cases. Individuals showing partial Goyet Q2 ancestry sometime between 25,000 years ago and 14,000 years ago, proving the line never actually broke. There aren't any. Every single genome sequenced in that window belongs to an entirely different, unrelated ancestry cluster, one researchers call fornal, tied to earlier layers at sites like El Mirón, which means whatever population was actually occupying that refuge territory during the coldest centuries of the Ice Age was not the group that came back 14,000 years later. Something else was living there instead. Not by years, by centuries. That is the size of the silence researchers are being asked to explain. This isn't a single missing skeleton. This is dozens of sampled genomes, multiple countries, a gap spanning more than 10,000 years, with a consistent total absence on one side and an abrupt, near-exact return on the other. The Goyet Q2 signature goes undetectable in the genetic record for a stretch longer than the entirety of recorded human civilization, over 14,000 years, before it resurfaces almost unchanged. If this lineage wasn't surviving quietly in some untouched refuge, waiting out the ice, then where does 14,000 years of DNA actually go? And is there a second, far stranger explanation waiting underneath the first one? The first theory researchers reach for is the simplest available option. They just haven't found the bones yet. Ancient DNA survives unevenly. Cold, dry cave environments, like Goyet itself, preserve genetic material for tens of thousands of years. Warm, wet, or acidic soil destroys it in a fraction of that time. Only a small percentage of Ice Age skeletons recovered from Europe have ever yielded usable DNA at all, and huge swaths of the continent, much of the Balkans, large parts of France, the coastal zones facing North Africa, remain almost entirely unsampled for this exact window of time. Proponents of this theory point to the raw numbers as evidence of how incomplete the picture still is. As of the mid-2020s, the total number of sequenced Upper Paleolithic European genomes older than 20,000 years is still counted in the low hundreds, globally. Hundreds, not thousands. A dataset that thin, they argue, is nowhere near large enough to declare any single lineage extinct with confidence. Under this theory, the Goyet Q2 population never disappeared at all. They simply lived somewhere researchers haven't recovered burials from yet. The leading candidate, a refuge zone along the Atlantic-facing coastline or the Western Mediterranean, much of which is no longer above water. Global sea levels have risen more than 120 meters since the height of the last glacial maximum. Entire probable habitation zones, entire likely burial grounds, are sitting on the seafloor right now, permanently out of reach. It's a clean explanation. Almost too clean, because it requires an unbroken population to survive completely undetected across more than 10 separate radiocarbon-dated cultural horizons, in multiple countries, for over 14,000 years, without leaving behind a single trace anyone has found, while every other regional lineage from the same window of time has turned up without this kind of difficulty. One population, and only one, manages to evade every single sampling effort for that long. The gaps in the record theory is tidy, almost too tidy, because a second, far more unsettling explanation doesn't rely on missing bones at all. It relies on the idea that this ghost was never fully human to begin with. That ghost, if this second theory holds, was never fully human to begin with. Not because the Goyet Q2 people themselves were some separate species. The individual buried at Goyet was, as far as anyone can tell, anatomically and genetically modern. The unsettling part runs deeper than that. Separate research into the broader human genome has already established that Neanderthals and Denisovans, two other hominin lineages that once shared the planet with us, carry DNA from something older still. a population that split off from the rest of the human family tree over 1 million years before Neanderthals even existed. Population geneticist Alan Rogers at the University of Utah modeled this mathematically in a 2020 paper in Science Advances, proposing that the ancestors of Neanderthals and Denisovans interbred with this deeply divergent, still unnamed lineage roughly 700,000 years ago or more. Think of it less as a single missing ancestor and more as a signal buried inside a signal. DNA within DNA, detectable only by the mathematical shape it leaves behind, never by a body anyone has actually held. That signal didn't stay contained. Neanderthals themselves went on to interbreed with the ancestors of modern humans, which is why non-African populations today carry, on average, 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, a figure established through the Nobel Prize-winning work of Svante Pääbo's team at the Max Planck Institute. Whatever ghost material was riding inside Neanderthal genomes came along for that ride too. Layered ancestry, folded into layered ancestry, folded again. Here is where it complicates everything the undersampling theory just tried to offer as comfort. That theory assumed one simple thing. If archaeologists eventually dig up the missing Goyet Q2-era skeletons, the mystery closes. But that assumption depends on knowing what you're looking for. If part of what's disappearing and reappearing across Ice Age Europe isn't a population of ordinary modern humans hiding in an unsampled refuge, but genetic material from a hominin lineage science hasn't formally identified or named yet, then there may be nothing on the surface to distinguish those remains from any other Ice Age skeleton. No skull shape flags it, no visible marker sets it apart. The ghost, under this theory, isn't necessarily missing. It could already be sitting in a museum drawer, catalogued, measured, photographed, and completely unflagged, because nobody has built the test that would recognize it. Two theories now sit side by side. One mundane, bones that simply haven't surfaced. One radical, DNA folded so many layers deep that even a recovered skeleton might not reveal what it's carrying. And neither one, on its own, accounts for the strange precision of the gap itself. 14,000 years of silence, then a near-exact return, clean on both ends. Which is exactly why a growing number of geneticists have quietly stopped trying to explain this with a single missing population at all. The third theory, the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud in absolute terms, doesn't ask what happened to one lineage. It asks how many lineages like this are still out there, completely unaccounted for. Researchers working from the same body of ancient DNA methodology pioneered in David Reich's lab at Harvard have increasingly modeled Ice Age Europe not as one thin, continuous population, but as something closer to an archipelago. Dozens of small, geographically isolated groups, rising and vanishing, and replacing one another, most of them leaving no directly sequenced representative behind at all. Under this model, a ghost population isn't a rare exception. It's a mathematical placeholder, a statistically necessary component that must have existed to explain the patterns showing up in later genomes, even though no skeleton confirming it has ever been found. Similar ghost components have already been proposed for ancient populations in Siberia. In the Near East and South Asia, different continents, same pattern, same silence. Applied to Goyet, this theory suggests something almost humbling. Goyet Q2 may not be uniquely mysterious at all. It might simply be the one ghost lineage whose return happened to be clean enough, dramatic enough, traceable enough, for anyone to notice. Dozens of others may have blinked in and out of the genetic record the same way, without ever being flagged, either because their reappearance was messier, harder to isolate, or because their remains simply haven't been found yet. This theory offers no closure. It isn't built to. It reframes the entire question from what happened to this one group to how many of these gaps are we not even seeing yet? A question current sample sizes cannot answer either way. Global databases of sequenced ancient genomes older than 10,000 years still number only in the low thousands across the entirety of Eurasia. A dataset that size is not large enough to rule anything out, which means, statistically, there are almost certainly more ghosts than the one this story is built around. However many there really are, one thing is certain: you would be standing on top of every single one of them without ever knowing it. Picture the moment this particular ghost went quiet. You are standing at the mouth of the Goyet Caves, in what is now Belgium, roughly 26,000 years ago. The air has already turned. Winters that once broke into shorter, survivable stretches are lengthening, and the ground stays frozen longer each year the ice sheet creeps south. Within a few thousand years, this will be uninhabitable tundra, permafrost stretching across what is now France, Germany, the Low Countries, and everyone who depends on this land for food will have to move or starve. The animals move first. Mammoth, reindeer, wild horse, the megafauna these people track and hunt, begin shifting their range south, following the retreating warmth, and the humans who depend on them have no real choice but to follow. Every group makes that decision differently. Some follow the herds toward the Mediterranean coastline, others cut inland, toward river valleys that still hold game and fresh water. Bands that once numbered in the dozens splinter into smaller and smaller units, each one gambling on a different direction, a different patch of shrinking land. This, not some single catastrophic extinction event, is what most researchers believe actually erases a lineage from the genetic record. Not a die-off, a scattering. Groups too small, too dispersed, to leave behind a population large enough for their DNA to survive intact into the next generation that gets sampled. Now move forward. 14,000 years forward, you are standing in a valley near Villabruna, in what is now northern Italy. A different group is settling here, hunting, building shelters, living lives entirely their own, with no memory, no knowledge, of Goyet, of the ice, of the choice their distant ancestors made at that cave mouth 14 millennia earlier. And yet, somewhere in their genome, almost impossibly, that same old signature is sitting quietly, waiting for someone 14,000 years later still to notice it was ever there. That reappearance at Villabruna isn't where this story ends. It's where the real twist begins. Here is the recontextualization that changes everything laid out so far. A growing number of geneticists now argue that the vanishing was never a vanishing at all, that the entire premise rests on a blind spot built into the method itself. A ghost population, technically, is not defined as a group that went extinct. It is defined as a group whose remains have simply never been sequenced. Full stop. The label describes a gap in the sampling record, not necessarily a gap in the population's actual existence. Run that back through everything already covered. The Goya Q2-related people very likely never disappeared demographically at all. Small pockets almost certainly survived, quietly, continuously, through the worst of the last glacial maximum, tucked into some refuge that has simply never produced a well-preserved burial anyone has found, interbreeding steadily with neighboring groups the entire time. The different ancestry cluster that keeps turning up in the genomes sampled from that in-between window, the one researchers call fornal, doesn't necessarily represent a population replacement at all. It may simply reflect which specific individuals, out of a much larger and more genetically diverse population, happen to die in conditions that preserve their DNA, and which happen to get excavated first. Under this reading, the reappearance at Villabruna wasn't a resurrection. It was the first time in 14,000 years that anyone happened to sequence a person carrying enough of that ancestry to detect it at all. Not extinct. Invisible. And if that's true here, it's true everywhere. If a lineage this significant, with a name, a founding skeleton, a documented signature, can hide in plain sight for 14,000 years, across multiple countries, undetected by some of the best-funded, most rigorous ancient DNA labs on the planet, then the tidy 3 population story taught as settled fact, the one built on Western hunter-gatherers, early farmers, and steppe pastoralists, is almost certainly missing entire branches that simply haven't surfaced in a lab yet. It also means the line separating a human population we haven't sampled from a hominin lineage we haven't identified is far blurrier than the consensus version admits. The statistical tools that detect ghost ancestry can tell you that something is missing. They cannot, on their own, tell you what that something actually was. One archaeogeneticist, describing this exact tension in a research seminar recounted by colleagues, put it more plainly than most published papers allow themselves to. You're not looking for a species. You're looking for the edge of what you're able to see at all. The mystery was never really, where did the DNA go? It was always, how much of European ancestry is still, right now, sitting just past the edge of what's been detected. Zoom out. And this stops being a story about one cave in Belgium. Every population alive today, on every continent, carries ghost contributions. Ancestry components that show up mathematically in genetic modeling but have never been matched to a single directly sequenced skeleton. The super-archaic lineage folded inside Neanderthal DNA. The dozens of statistically inferred, never sampled populations proposed for Ice Age Siberia, the Near East, South Asia. Europe's case is simply the most visible version of something that appears to be universal. Every lineage, everywhere, may be carrying passengers no one has named yet. The tidy ancestry story any person tells about themselves, the clean percentages, the named migrations, the confident timeline, is built entirely on which skeletons happen to survive 14,000 years of soil chemistry, which ones happen to get excavated, and which ones happen to get funded for sequencing. Change any single one of those variables, and the story changes with it. Not because the science is wrong, because the sample was always smaller than the truth. The DNA in those European bones was never really gone, and it was never fully identified either. It sits in the narrow, uncomfortable space between detected and understood, a space that, on the current evidence, most of human ancestry still occupies. Think of the genome less as a settled record and more as a manuscript copied and recopied across tens of thousands of years, with entire pages missing, water damaged, or simply never opened. The words that survive treated as the whole story, when they were only ever the fragments someone happened to find. Scientists really did find a ghost DNA code hidden in European bones. They just haven't finished being shocked by how much of it is still missing.